This is going to wind up to be a Georgia Guidestones Part 4. We've dumped that off a long time ago. And not because it's not important or you shouldn't know that the way they think about us. But anyway, it also sometimes I get under it, mainly because it's so, I think, dastardly and so nefarious. Basically, this cat's a liar, and I have to laugh, this Georgia Guidestone, quasi-Stonehenge, you can find it on Google Earth if you want to. Really is, as far as Google Earth is concerned, no real address, as they say in here. I think it says Guidestone Road or something like that. I don't know. But, yeah, you can go check it out. It's on a rise outside of, I forget what town it is. But you can find it, and especially I think you can hit it from Wikipedia, whatever that thing's worth. You can find the coordinates for it, and it's not far from the 33rd degree latitude. Speaking of, when we play the game Stupid or Liar, and this guy, Robert Christian, obviously it's a pseudonym, and he's a liar. And I also wonder, too, it's funny, he's a depopulationist, whoever this individual is, or if this person is a personification of an amalgamation of certain people. But I was wondering, thinking about, who's the biggest advocate for depopulation in the state of Georgia? Would that be Ted Turner? Atlanta, which is pretty much on the 33rd degree parallel, which they think would be, perhaps in the east, what Denver would be in the west, if there was going to be 2 seats of government, or, kind of like, it's unusual sometimes for counties like this one to have kind of like a dual county seat, because the county is so wide and there's really nothing going on in the middle. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if Ted Turner was the cat that was behind this? Just a guess. The other thing is, too, I'm having such a hard time nowadays, I can't watch TV anymore. And I can't even watch the Today Show to keep my finger on the pulse of what, those son of a bitches are doing and what they're promoting from Rockefeller Center. And it's like they bring these people on, and you know where they're going to come from any side of an issue. I mean, if it's vaccinations, like, yeah, stick those needles in your arms, baby, you got to have it. And I'm looking at these people they bring on, it's almost like I feel like I want to go up to them and rip their mask off and just say, just tell the truth. I mean, even if this is what you want, if you're coming with a subjective opinion, with the opinion of someone else, just tell me. Just say it. But don't pass this thing off as truth. And I just feel like they all come up there with like these masks on, and I'm like, it makes me want to puke. Anyway, oh, here we are. We're up to, this will be part 4, but this is chapter 7 of Common Sense Renewed, the Georgia Guidestones by Robert Christian. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the stuff he does in this because he we've done this before. The guy pontificates and explains to us the way things really are. And it's like, spare me, will you, dude? I mean, like, no, I really don't want to hear it from you. So what they do is they set up the problem, and what we're really looking for is the solution that they're coming up with, because that's where it gets really interesting. Now, in this part 7, saying proposals for improving our society, they break it up into, I think it's something like 7 sections here. 8, 9. And I'll hit the high points. I'm not going to go through all this, and you don't really want to hear it. However, you want to buy this book. I don't even know what the chances are of you getting it. It may be out there. Brian from Washington State sent it to me, and I intend to send it back to him. He bought 2 copies thinking that these might be really rare, and they might be, I don't know. Remember, too, that this was written 1986, keep that in mind. Second edition came out in 87, but for the most part, this was concocted probably in 85 into 86. So, proposals for improving our society, Chapter 7. There are many areas in American society which deserve planned improvement. Simple proposals for solving complex problems are often inadequate, but they may suggest new approaches which deserve consideration. I offer here the thoughts of one citizen relating to some of our more pressing problems. And he gets into education, which, as you all know, is a mess. And I'm not defaming teachers who really care, but those teachers, if they're going to be really honest, know that it is an absolute mess. It is a money sucker. It will never get enough money. It will never be equitable. And in the meantime, when they should be teaching the children, they wind up more training them and getting into their personal lives and usurping parental rights, which they would claim, obviously, don't really exist because you can't find two parents in one home. Sometimes you can't find any parents in one home. And I'm sure some of the people like Annie Senior's wife who has to deal with contact information, if in fact she does get involved with it in the education system that she's in up in Utica, New York. I mean, I found for myself that when you had contact information, mostly emergency contact information, you'd have like Betty Smith, and it wouldn't be a Smith for a contact person there. I mean, it goes on to aunts and uncles and grandparents. And the percentage of that is greater than 50%, without a doubt. And it was the case also at times with children who have been challenged, no fault of their own. But when there are problems, severe learning disabilities and such, you'll find out it's sometimes close to 100%. All right, so we know education is garbage. It says a nation's people are its most valuable resource. Like other resources, it is worthless unless it is developed and put to work. In the modern world, a nation of illiterate and undereducated human beings is unable to compete. Nations that are most successful in rearing children become knowledgeable, responsible, and dedicated adults are destined to prevail in the world competition for goods, markets, and intellectual achievement. That doesn't necessarily ring true what's going on internationally. All right, so they go on and they state all the problems and the stats. Okay, schools in Japan do this and we do this. And it says here about what goes on in the United States. Teachers are sometimes abused by students, and fail to achieve the necessary authority from parents and taxpayers to assert appropriate discipline and attitudes in the classroom. Yeah, and add to that administrators who run scared and would give up teachers, and do give up teachers in a second if it saves their butt. So basically, you, the teacher, are quite alone. Disruptive student behavior by some hinders the educational process for others. Teachers are not well paid, often receiving less compensation than the janitors who sweep their hallways. No. Administrative staffs are top-heavy with marginally useful assistants, coaches, coordinators, and counselors. Many of these employees hold jobs which have been mandated by legislators through well-meaning but inappropriate measures designed to aid the handicapped, to promote racial equality, or to administer redundant rules and regulations imposed from outside the school system. All right, blah, blah, blah. All right, where are we going? Here we go. It would be prudent to develop a two-track system in American schools. Well, some would argue that's already there. And what would that be? You would have your, the upper echelon and those who do the wet work. Yes, a two-track system letting the most capable young students enter a curriculum that is more intense, far-ranging, and demanding than that for average young minds. A separation of the two tracks could be at the second or third grade level with provision for crossovers in either direction at later stages as indicated by individual student progress and desires. Now, we had tracking. That was a big problem when I was in the school in the late 60s. You could choose academic, you could choose commercial, you could choose industrial and all this other stuff, and everybody said that this was wrong, this was tracking, and it may have been. I mean, I don't know. At least, you had a choice. You made the choice, and you made it later on in your career rather than have somebody else making it for you here, perhaps in the second and third grade. It says all students should be challenged with a curriculum designed to prepare them to enter the competitive world. Excellence should be stressed for all occupational levels, from boot black to corporate officer. Pride in performance should be instilled in all Americans. The course of study should be flexible, permitting some students to proceed with college preparation, while others are directed into specific occupational fields. The array of courses offered should be based upon realistic appraisals of the job market as reflected in the recommendation of potential employers and a survey of help-wanted columns in major newspapers. Recommendations of potential employers would mean the corporations will tell them what they want, and that's exactly what's going on. It isn't a case of be all you can be, it's a case of be what we need you to be. And most of that stuff is straight to Walmart. Let's see. Depending upon their aptitudes and desires, students may be encouraged to become chefs, clerks, domestics, mechanics, or hundreds of other performers in our society. Maximum effort and performance must be stressed at all times. Chefs must think of themselves as good chefs, mechanics as good mechanics, and executives as good executives. I mean, who's this guy talking to? Please give me a pacifier while you continue. What a jerk. Certificates granted after completion of specific courses must honestly reflect student performance so that employers can rely on the significance of the certificate. Foreign language study has long been neglected in our schools. It was not essential to our prosperity in the past, but times have changed. Many Americans must become fluent in the languages of our trading partners so that our interests are properly served. We must develop language studies in our schools. Wait a second. If you're going to have this two-track system, and you're going to have people, obviously, that are going to deal internationally in commerce and other things, why does the guy who's going to be a boot black, or the woman who's going to be a boot black, or a domestic, or whatever, need to know a foreign language? Because they're not going to be doing international commerce. Well, it gets better, and there's a reason why, of course, and it starts with the letter E. We must develop language studies in our schools beginning in the early grades and continuing through the university level. We are fortunate in possessing many immigrants who are fluent in the languages of their homelands who can assist in teaching our children. Yeah, that's right. Get a couple of migrants that come in and help teach Spanish, or whatever. Yeah, just because they're from someplace else, they're skilled. And they're complaining about teachers being undercertified, and you're going to take somebody off the street who's an immigrant who can speak another language. See, there's the contradictions in the crap in this stuff. Many students come from socially inadequate homes. Here we go. Frequently with only one parent. Very often that parent is educationally deprived, unable to teach the child courteous behavior, good grooming, proper grammar, and the social graces that are so helpful in occupational and social advancement. Important early training is neglected. Our schools must serve in loco parentis, making up deficiencies that otherwise will handicap ill-favored children for life. So here is the educational usurpation of parental rights. It takes a village to raise a child. All right, it goes into why we have the dress codes and all this other stuff. Fine. What else? All right, let's get down to it. Wholesale reorganization of our educational system is essential, but that will not solve all our training problems. Very good choice of words there, bro. It must be accompanied by legislation which will effectively encourage socially acceptable behavior. We're going to legislate socially acceptable behavior. And who's going to decide that? What is and what isn't socially acceptable? Including responsible parenting by all our citizens. So the government's going to tell you what you need to know to raise your kid. Our present social chaos can be significantly corrected through rational actions by our elected officials if supported by an informed electorate. And we know that he doesn't want everybody to vote. And not that it matters anyway. And here you have just a really nice window dressing for the state will raise the kid and educate it. Where have we heard that before? Now on to number 2, morality. Oh, this is always a biggie. All right, let's state the problem. Morality and immorality are forbidden subjects in our public schools, in large part because of efforts by misguided, quote, liberals. No, not that. To prevent the teaching of any identifiably religious doctrines, yet we permit anti-religious philosophies to be presented in a variety of courses and leave blank those pages which could tell the admittedly imperfect story of religions as they have attempted to conquer our animal nature in the course of history. Now this all sounds good, and it gets even better, but there's a real big but statement in this. It talks about our present situation is paradoxical. We acknowledge shortcomings in our religious beliefs and understanding. We observe great diversity in the creeds and ceremonies of our citizens. Yet we manage to open each session of Congress with an appeal to the Almighty for guidance. We include the phrase, under God, in our Pledge of Allegiance. Now, you know the story with that. I won't do that. We recognize the deity on many of our coins, which is an absolute scandal and a shame and a disgrace to Jehovah. We have provided chaplains of every denomination as spiritual guides for our military personnel. The intentions of our founding fathers was apparent in their own actions, and what would that be? Yet today we strain the doctrine of separation of church and state to such an extreme in our public schools that we prevent any mention of God in the classroom. Sounds good, but it gets better. So here's where we're going with this whole thing. In view of long traditions which have persisted without serious challenge in our courts since our nation was founded, it should not require a constitutional amendment to permit elective courses in religion in our public schools. It should be no more contrary to public policy to offer a prayer at commencement exercises than it has been for 2 centuries to offer prayers in the Hall of Congress. Students in our schools are taught modern concepts in chemistry, biology, history, and other secular subjects. I thought you told us that everything was deficient, like back in the education section. They learn to question conclusions that are not supported by facts. It will therefore be essential that religion teachers are prepared to present their subject matter in a manner which will be acceptable to enlightened minds. So why are you, here you're going to gear the matter to make it more acceptable to enlightened minds. So don't worry about them dealing with the information and coming up to their own conclusions. Take whatever you can and mold it to what they will find acceptable. Okay? From a harmonious blending of religious belief and tradition with an awareness of social needs, it will be possible to generalize rules of morality which can be accepted by society at large as guides of personal, corporate, and government contact. Once again, be a good little lumpen to the state. Number 3, regulating our national borders. A nation that cannot control its borders is like a house without walls. Its citizens and commerce are in constant jeopardy. Right? Although Americans have traditionally favored liberal immigration policies, and our citizens are of immigrant stock, our present circumstances now demand major changes. We are straining our resource base to provide our citizens with a comfortable standard of living. Several other nations now exceed our per capita income, and we are losing out in the international competition for industrial production of many kinds. And that's not because Americans are not good, it's because they're deliberately being shipped out. They're being shipped out not because they take a look at the American worker and say, basically you suck. They're doing it because they want to obviously pay somebody in the Far East like 2 cents an hour. Yet they want to come back for that widget, which costs $20 and only Americans can pay it. And they'll bring it back and obviously offer it up at that price for the only people in the world who can afford to pay it. That price, and that's Americans, whom they don't want to pay that salary. So, again, all Americans flagellate themselves because we suck, and that's the reason why meat production left. Okay. Millions of Americans are unemployed, a situation further aggravated by the entry of many women into the workforce. Nearly 3 of 4 mothers are now employed outside the home, a situation made necessary by economic and social pressures, yet given us by whom? Nearly 10% of Americans are not working and are supported by public charity of one kind or another. Paradoxically, employers are unable to recruit enough workers to fill many openings in certain less than glamorous fields. Here comes the big lie. While thousands of Americans are supported in idleness in New York or Detroit, and you know who that aims at racially, foreigners are smuggled across our borders by the hundreds of thousands each year to take jobs that our own people reject, which is bullcrap. Absolute bullcrap. The old story, it's what Americans don't want to do. Yeah, tell me why I was landscaping in the 80s, by the way, Isn't that the job that nobody wants to do? Anyway. In cities such as Chicago, hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens are driving taxis, staffing hotels, working in factories, and doing other work rejected by idle but able-bodied Americans. Here we go. Be on yourself. Big guiltplex. Number 2. We can no longer afford to tolerate this ridiculous situation. An illiterate Mexican or Jamaican citizen will travel thousands of miles to eagerly seek such employment. Unemployed Americans should be required to make similar efforts. So long as we continue to provide a minimum income for our lazy or unskilled workers, they will continue to be non-workers. Changes must be made, and promptly. Remember, this was written in 85 and 86. If a farmer in Florida or California needs field workers, unemployed Americans in other parts of the nation must be required to accept such employment, even if this involves retraining and relocating them. When necessary, we should assist citizens in moving from areas of high unemployment to areas where jobs are available. Inconvenience and readjustment are a necessary part of the process and must be accepted as a matter of course. Most of our ancestors crossed an ocean to come to this land of opportunity, usually in poverty and without government assistance. Yeah, only to fall into poverty and need government assistance. This whole idea has been brought up in Aurelio Pesci's The Chasm Ahead, when he reflects on if you don't have depopulation, then there are certain very shall we say, unctuous solutions to the problem. And one of them they talk about is the grafting of populations. That's the term that's used. I believe he quotes a J.D. Bernal in that book. And he says, well, we might have to graft populations and shift working forces. And that's another thing that's at the root of regionalization and union building going to world government. And that is, take, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. If there's work to be done in, Chihuahua, Mexico, and they got to bring somebody down from British Columbia, that's what happens. So it's going to be like a big job bank, like remember that, what was that called? When they used to have that kind of, U.S. jobs thing, I forget. You go in and you see what's available and they put you to work. Well, that's what's going to happen on a large basis. So this whole idea of relocating workers is going to be very inherent and important to the idea of a North American Union, which is only talking, we're only talking about NAFTA and free trade and the FTAA, but what that, and free trade, but what that means is that the workers have nothing going for them, nothing whatsoever. They will be told where to go, what to do, and how much they'll make, and that's the way it's going to be. Or, as George Bernard Shaw said, you could be executed in a kindly manner. And that's in The Intelligent Women's Guide to Socialism by good old George Bernard Shaw. Please take a look at that and read that in the epilogue. What a wonderful guy, the glib playwright. Yeah, right here, Clowney. Now to transportation. Predictions of any kind are uncertain at best, but you keep making them, man. Anticipated trends are often reversed or modified by new discoveries and altered circumstances and consciousness. An industrial society scattered over a territory as large as ours must have a distribution network for raw materials, finished goods, and people. Our present transportation system depends almost entirely upon internal combustion engines fueled with petroleum products. We are rapidly depleting our own reserves of crude oil and are increasingly dependent upon foreign sources. That's not true. Even those reserves are finite and will not last forever. Peak oil at a peak age, early in 1985-86. The age of petroleum is but a brief interlude in human history. Yeah. Efforts are being intensified to develop alternative energy sources. Yeah, how did that work out? The direct conversion of sunlight to electrical energy or the indirect use of sunlight to generate hydrogen from water both hold promise. And it goes on about this stuff. And of course, we could have done this back in the 70s and it never happened. Because we're never getting off petroleum for as long as, well, I tell you, we may never get off it. And it's because the oil oligarchy isn't going to allow anybody to go anywhere else except to them. I don't believe that the source is unreplenishable, and I'm not saying I wouldn't like to go to something cleaner without a doubt. I'm all for it, always have been. I just know that it's not going to happen. You get this yapping about, when was the last time you heard about hybrid cars recently, or hydrogen? You go through this all the time, but it always winds up going back to dependence on petroleum, because those who have it, as far as own it, know exactly what the condition of it is, and they're going to make it scarcer through a fake shortage and this idea of peak oil, and you're going to pay more, but you'll never get off it. They'll see to it until the time comes when they want to switch to something else. By that time, we'll all be in chains anyway. And the reason I'm saying it, because he does mention something here that always made sense, and because it made sense, and because it was efficient, it never was promoted. If anything, it was degraded. And let's go right to it. Let's see. As a result, we observe railroad companies completely eliminating tracks which once served many small towns and hamlets, leaving these centers totally dependent on trucks and automobiles for all transportation needs. Prudent planning would place existing railroad right-of-ways in public custody. They will be needed again and sooner than many anticipate. Steel wheels rolling on steel rails powered by abundant coal reserves can still provide America with efficient, reliable, and economical transportation. There was never a reason to trash the railroads unless there was another reason. Railroads always made sense, both for carrying goods and for carrying people. But the one thing that probably made the most sense, was least obtrusive, and probably one of the safest, just somehow didn't happen. And it's true. We watched the Penn Central tracks in northeast New Jersey go from 4 tracks carrying both goods and people to 2 carrying only goods. And of course, who made the money on the bus systems and everything else that were promoted? Then they thought about taking buses, outfitting them with train wheels, and putting them on the tracks, and that probably would work too. But it never happens, and there's a reason for it. And you don't need the power of trains by coal or by diesel. You do have electricity, which is a great source of energy, but that somehow never happened. Going on, for reasons of military preparedness, if for no other, we should consider rejuvenating our railroads. When petroleum sources shrink, we will still have coal. Modern technology permits coal to be used with little pollution, whether in railroad engines or in central generating plants that service electric rail power. It might be desirable for the federal government to establish a national railway network maintained by the government, but open to privately owned railroad companies in much the same manner that now lets private truckers use our highways. That's, Amtrak was just messed up to the max. And it was messed up for a purpose. Light rail or bullet trains and stuff seem to work everywhere in Europe, but never here. But there's a reason for that as well. This all makes sense. Of course it does. But it didn't happen. And it won't happen until finally we get to a point probably after the war and regionalization and the unions, that this will come in because we'll have, obviously, monopoly capitalists, which they are now, but they will be fully in control, and they will do what's best for them. And things will start to make sense because they're going to be very efficient. So it goes on about, monetary savings to our economy would be considerable, and our dependence upon foreign fuels would be lessened. Right, okay. And let's see, now we go on to city planning. Oh, this is a good one. I'll hit this one. They go through all the problems, blah, blah, blah. Today, it is not unusual for 5 or 10 million souls to live and work in a single confluent area of streets, buildings, and other structures sprawled over perhaps 100 square miles, with here and there a park or a pond reserved as a gesture of reconciliation to an offended Mother Nature. Gaia. All right, blah, 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 right? It says, okay, here we go. And this smacks of islands of habitat, which is what they want for us. And what's also going to be that concept on steroids, and that is the community of character. Yet once it is in place, a megalopolis represents great attractions for new businesses. It provides resources and markets close at hand, with every conceivable sort of secondary support in the form of machines, transport, consultants, plus a large labor pool. It is possible that a relatively small encouragement in the form of tax incentives and lower labor costs might lure future new enterprises to more rural settings. Such trends have become apparent in the shift of our textile industry and others from the Northeast into our Sunbelt states in recent years. Oh really? Where are they down here? The social rewards which would follow an expansion and general application of planned decentralization of business and industry would justify their costs many times over. Achieving that goal will require overruling purely economic forces that now dominate city growth. Slums can be eliminated. Homes, factories, and commercial and retail centers can be spatially arranged with efficient internal travel patterns and with adequate separation of incompatible functions. Electronic intercommunications could compensate for the loss of physical proximity between specific urban entities. The savings in human hours and commuting fuel alone would pay a large part of the cost of decentralization. An increased role for urban planning can do much for improving the daily lives of our descendants. The one thing I still can't put together is one of the planks in the manifesto is the breaking down of the distinction between cities and rural areas, which would seem to be what they're talking about, this decentralization. But then you have, obviously, be supported by powers behind the scene of this wilding concept to bring most of America back to some primordial state and forcing people to live in these islands of habitat. So it seems to have two contradictory things going on, and I don't know how this all plays out unless, and I believe the environmentalists are being used to a certain extent and don't even know it. And so are we going to have this decentralization where rurality is being used? I don't know. It does say that in the manifesto, and if you take a look at those 10 planks, you'll find out, for the most part, all 9 of them have found resonance here as well, as they have in other countries. Doesn't matter what you've been called as far as if you're socialist or communist or capitalist. That's the old joke, we got federalized, well, that's okay. Well, federalized is being Sovietized, only you call it federalized. So, anyway. So take a look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Go up to Marx.org and look for that document, and then check it out. I think it's in the section called Proletariats and something or other, I forget. And there's the 10 planks. It's always 10 planks. It's always 10 commandments, But it's just a coincidence. This is number 6, conservation. These are short. These last 4 are real short. I'll read them in toto. The gene pools of the plants, animals, and microorganisms which survive in the remaining wild areas of the world have required hundreds of millions of years to develop their present diversity. Expanding human occupation of the lands and seas is causing the extinction of many unique living forms every year. Okay, so here we go with this. We're going to decentralize, but we don't want to expand. I don't know. Here in America, we have replaced much of the original wilderness with farms, cities, towns, and roads. Intensive farming is causing the loss of topsoil at a rate that threatens our long-term ability to feed a large population. It is essential that we regulate our land use, prohibiting destructive farming practices and encouraging the preservation of natural areas. Eventually, we will be able to restore expanses of prairie, forest, and wetland to their primeval state. Hey, here we go. With reestablished populations of their natural flora and fauna. It may even be possible to develop genetic manipulations, GMO, which will create new life forms to enter the self-regulating processes of evolutionary selection. Oh, is that right? Create new life forms to enter the self-regulating processes of evolutionary selection. Now, hold on. Just think about that for a second. Okay, and what it said before about the bit about genetic manipulations, which will create these new life forms. Remember the winnowing, the short story we did about how if they went ahead and did this, and we could look at it as being GMO. Nobody knows what kind of manipulation is taking place, but obviously, if a person eats a tomato and is allergic for some reason, to fish, and throws a heart attack or has a highly allergic reaction and kicks off. Not knowing whatever in the world did it, because the tomato would never be expected, obviously, if it's obviously in a salad or something like that. Well, you see how that would, in other words, those who could resist the GMO regulation would obviously be stronger genetically, and that's okay. You can continue on, especially if you might be in a breeding period of your life. But if you were weak for some reason, and this either made you extremely ill unto death or killed you, well, then you would be culled out. So just listen to that again. It may even be possible to develop genetic manipulations which will create new life forms to enter the self-regulating processes of evolutionary selection. In future ages, our descendants may compensate in this manner for the harm we are causing today through unplanned excesses of our own reproduction. So, if you don't think that GMO stuff, besides helping corporations with shelf life, is not what it said in that book, that short story by Asimov, The Winnowing, where nobody would know that it was in the manipulation, in the case of the winnowing, in the grain. But it would be perceived as being plague-like. They would not know it would be in the grain, because some would be sick and recover, some would die, and some would never be affected. Now, you think about what Asimov wrote, and I'm not pinning it on this guy. I'm just saying that he knew what was possible, and he wrote that a little bit, about 8 years before this book came out. Very interesting. I don't even know, but I think I have The Winnowing still up there if you want to listen to me or read that. Or go find it for yourself and read it for yourself. Very interesting. All right, medical costs. Here we go. Americans now devote 1/10 of their national income to medical, hospital, and nursing care. So, whose fault is that? Costs continue to spiral upward. Whose fault is that? Due largely to endless new developments in technology, drugs, and public expectations of immortality. That's bullshit. Yeah. It's because you guys can't charge enough of this crap. And if people aren't sick, you'll make them think they're sick, so they'll take the drugs that will cure what really isn't really wrong with them. In theory, there is no scientific limit to further advances, but from a practical and fiscal standpoint, there must be limits. We simply cannot afford to replace every failing heart with a pump or transplant. We cannot afford heroic measures to prolong by a few weeks or months the existence of every aging body. It is self-defeating to believe that we can continue to make these sophisticated services available and to lower their costs simply by mandating lower prices. It will be necessary for well-informed citizens to work with knowledgeable physicians in establishing guidelines that will make possible a reasonable allocation or, quote, rationing of the care we can collectively afford, favoring those individuals whose continuing lives are most valuable to society at large. Now, just chew on that for a while. Okay? So here's another thing. It's like, well, maybe you ought to just turn into Soylent Green. And then we get into litigation. And they're going about how we can, blah, blah, blah. I will cut this one a little short because you're all familiar with damages being awarded. It says, in addition, there should be legislatively determined limits to jury awards and legal fees. Life is full of risks. One of them is insurance companies. A single human life is priceless. Well, you didn't say that on the other page, asshole. Yet under our present system, persuasive attorneys can convince juries that awards of millions of dollars are appropriate penalties to assess against citizens whose actions resulted in loss of life or limb for injured clients. The same attorneys then pocket a large fraction of those generous awards for their legal services. As a result, liability insurance carriers are unable to provide financial protection at affordable prices for citizens or companies or agencies of government whose activities expose them to risk of litigation. Analyses of the financial records of many large insurance companies indicate that only a small fraction of liability premiums is paid to injured parties. The lion's share is consumed in the expenses of litigation. So is that the fault of the person who winds up maimed for life? that all this gets sucked off before it gets to them. It's like, well, you weren't getting it anyway, so like, why don't we just forget about making the award? And that is so precious, right? All lives. What does it say? What is he say? A single human life is priceless, but it didn't state that under the old medical cost one, where we talked about continuing lives, keeping those whose continuing lives are most valuable to society at large, and the rest of you can have a nice day. America is almost alone in this pattern. It is time for us to follow the example of Great Britain or New Zealand, where liability insurance is far less costly and where certain disability and death costs become a burden of the national social insurance programs. Oh, how do you speak out of both sides of your neck like that? And now we get to the E word I spoke to about before. Now he gets down to it. It's a new language. Yay. And I'll just get down to it. He goes through the whole thing. He gets, oh, God, it's so condescending. The human larynx, throat, and mouth differ from those of other creatures. Oh, go on. Give me a break. All right, here are the last three paragraphs. And you know where this is headed. Esperanto, the E word. Designing a universal human language for future generations will require discovery of the most efficient combinations and sequences of phonemes to most clearly express our thoughts with all their subtleties and nuances. Our aesthetic sense will require symbolic forms in sound and in letters to be pleasing to the ear and to the eye. Phonemes will be arrayed in patterns which reflect variations in function. Each sound will correspond precisely with a single visual symbol. Inflections, pauses, rhythms, and other modifications of intonation will be indicated by accent syllables. The visual characters will permit ease of writing by hand in the same form used in type so that both can be, quote, recognized by the seeing eyes of machines. In this way, it will be possible for words to be spoken in the presence of an appropriate electromechanical device and to be transcribed in printed form by that device. Conversely, the machine will also be able to read the printed version and vocalize it as clearly intelligible speech. Voice replication, think Flight 93. Development of the alphabet's syllabary of approximately 200 symbols will facilitate constructing a truly new language, de novo. Oh, here we go. Unlike Esperanto, Interlingua, and others, the new language could evolve to become a universal tool for serving certain special communication needs of humanity. And what might that be? All right, so that's Chapter 7 in the book Common Sense Renewed, written by, quote, Robert Christian. And we can also call this Common Sense Renewed or How to Kill Yourself and Really Help Out the World in a Green Manner. That has been this reading of the Georgia Guidestones series, and we will be back next week with another edition if my stomach can handle it. Well, I think it can handle it. See you later.